I mean, it's, you know, UFO books don't sell large quantities. I mean, I'm wondering if on the next step is to sort of gauge what the response is within the UFO community, and then maybe, you know, we might see something in the New York Times or the Washington Post if one of these people goes to those sorts of like organisations. That's speculation, but you know, whether it'll take it further or just confuse matters, as it often does in this subject, I don't know. But that's sort of the background and history of the group. And if anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer. Thanks.
Nick, I was real intrigued to hear this today because when I was reading, when I first started coming to the MUFON group, I was reading some accounts in the symposium catalog from the, you know, the International Symposium meeting, and there were some personal stories in there by different people about their personal encounters. And this one gentleman told the story that as a boy, somewhere out west, I don't know, California or where it was, I sort of remember it as sort of a desert type area, but wherever he lived as a boy, that this disc or whatever it was landed, and he saw it, and he was very curious about it, and when he approached it, a very Nordic-looking gentleman walked out with the long blonde hair. He gave that same kind of description that you hear. And he invited the boy onto the ship and showed him around, told him what was there, and could actually communicate with him. I don't remember if it was in English or not, but he was able to communicate. And he said to the boy, and this shocked me when I read it, and it started me thinking about this subject you're talking about today. He said, do you know that story that they tell about Jesus Christ? And the boy said, yes. He said, well, that's a lie. They spread that so that nations would kill one another. And I was just astounded when I read that, and because I am a Christian. And so this started my thinking process. And I said, well, if there are demonic beings on earth and angelic hosts on earth, why is there maybe not the same thing in the universe? You know, God created all of it, in my opinion. And so this to me sounded like something that would come straight out of the pit of hell, you know, to this young man. So then I brought the spiritual aspect into my thinking about UFOs. I didn't give that any thought at first. I just thought they were there and we were learning about them, and you know, they exist. But so when I heard about your talk today, I was most interested in, because I haven't heard anybody else talk on this.
No, there's actually several books being published. There's one in 1995, which is written by a man named Nelson Pacheco and a man named Tommy Bland. And I think he used to live in Texas, and he's a UFO researcher. They co-authored a book. It's called Unmasking the Enemy. And that actually covers a lot of very, very similar ground. Not from the perspective of what the government knows, but their interpretations of the whole UFO phenomenon. And there was one called UFOs What's Happening, which was published in, I think, 73 or 74. And that covers the same area as well. And I think altogether there's maybe 6 or 7 full-length books. I think that the most memorably titled one it's called Round Trip to Hell in a Flying Saucer, which is got like a sensational title, and it's a similar grounds.
Yeah, there's 2 movies out that kind of relate to what you were talking about today. One which I haven't seen, it's Men Who Stare at Goats.
Oh, yeah.
It's supposed to be about where they're training people to kill with their mind.
Yes.
And the other one's The Fourth Kind, which I did see. And it's supposed to be an actual events related in it. In fact, they claim it's real, and they actually have the person who was abducted and other things like that actually speaking on it, and they have an actor to kind of fill in the places. But that movie will make you stop and think if you watch it. It's well worth seeing.
Okay, I haven't seen that.
Do you have any particular thinking about why the president is shutting down NASA?
Well, you know, I mean, you can look at it from different angles. You can look at conspiratorial angle, you can look at it from saving money. You know, I think.
Shouldn't have sent the guy out to.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's difficult to know. I mean, I think with NASA, people kind of looked at it back in the 60s, where we're going to go to the moon, and we're going to achieve something, we're going to land on the moon for the very first time ever, put people on the moon. Today, I don't think people, particularly politicians and people funding people, don't see the next step, the next big thing. You know, the next big thing would probably be like a manned mission to Mars or something. But nobody sort of, that's not in your immediate mind. You know, back in the 60s, you know, when Kennedy said we're going to put people on the moon in the next 10 years, we haven't had that big speech of how there's going to be this huge project within the next, by 2020, we're going to put people on Mars and everybody's behind it. It's almost like, well, NASA today is, oh yeah, the space shuttle goes up for a day or two, then it comes down again. They launch occasional satellites, big deal. You know, there isn't, in other words, there isn't this impetus where people find it amazing. The space program isn't amazing anymore and fantastic. It's just, you know, they're putting another bit of tin up in the sky or whatever. And I think that's possibly part of it. It's people thinking the idea of exploration and the wonder of what might be out there has gone. I think, you know, there's better things to do down here, I think people think.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
I'd like to add something to that. I don't believe that NASA has been a real space program all along. I know Lynn Chilson, our resident rocket scientist who was a manager there at NASA, you know, would have different feelings about it, but Ben Rich, the CEO of the Lockheed Skunk Works, said that we have the technology now to go to the stars, and that all of that technology is locked up, probably not to be brought out for the benefit of mankind, short of Armageddon. And so I think that all of the presidents who come into office since Reagan have been brought in on this fact, and each one of them, according to their own political agenda, see this as just more military spending that they can use for social programs or something else. So they're cutting back on that with this administration, and because they know that it's really not necessary. And I will tell you one more thing I think I've mentioned to other groups. When I was a young man, I was a liberated teenager. I lived on my own for the last couple of years through high school, barely surviving, on my own, going to school. And I was taken in by a man and his family, a distant cousin, who was a powerful politician in D.C. And I only saw him once or twice a year. And his family lived in Fort Worth, where near the school I attended was Pascal. But the gentleman came home during Christmas break. Very, very interesting character. But he told me that he was one of 3 men who made the final allocations for the Black Budget programs that the government funded. One year, the allocation was so high that I guess the 4-star general sitting there waiting for the check or whatever, they told him, say, look, we're concerned about where all these billions are going, and there's just no oversight. We're not going to sign the authorization until you clue us in on where the money's going. And so he said they took them to a hangar that was full of what he called flying saucers of all different sizes and types. This was in the early 60s. And they said, this is where all the money's going. It didn't say, Uncle Ham didn't say, he saw little aliens. He didn't say they flew around in one or anything. It's just, he kind of clamped up at the point where, what am I doing telling this to an 18-year-old, 17-year-old? But I absolutely believe him. And that was in the early 60s, while we were still shooting things with chemical rockets off of Canaveral and places. So they had more advanced technology that the public wasn't aware of back then. So that's my opinion why these programs constantly get cut back. We probably already have craft that have seen most of our solar system, if not more. And as Ben Rich said, we have the technology to travel to the stars, and it wouldn't take years like people believe. Einstein was wrong. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
So since you've done so much research on UFOs and you've written this, where would you put this, where would you fit this in? Or if you were going to write a book, sort of, where would you slot this? And what would your thesis be and where this fits in?
My conclusion is that in the same way that government agencies throughout the years have looked into the UFO subject, this is another example. For example, the Air Force had there's been a lot of talk about secret groups, but what we know about verifiably existing groups, back in the late 40s, the Air Force had a group called SIGN, Project SIGN, which then became Project Grudge. And there's a story that Project Grudge did at one point conclude that some UFOs were extraterrestrial, but the Air Force didn't want to hear it, and so they burnt the file. And in 1952-53, there was a CIA organisation called the Robertson Panel. And the Robertson Panel was less concerned about what UFOs were, but how the Russians might exploit the subject. For example, there was a fear that if the Russians would, I guess, create a fake UFO wave, they'd insert UFO stories in the American press and have people over here who are on their side say, we saw a UFO, etc. So there was this huge wave of sightings, and then they would launch a sneak attack, and everybody would wonder, what is it, UFOs? And they would hold back from retaliating until it might be too late. And that was the CIA's concern, how the subject could be exploited. Then Project Blue Book, which is the Air Force's project that closed down in '69, they concluded there was nothing to it. These guys concluded it was demonic. So I think what this tells us is that lots of different groups in the government have looked into this phenomenon, some with preconceived ideas and belief systems as to what might be going on, others totally open-minded but lacking the hard evidence. So they're as fallible, they're just human like the rest of us. So just because they wear a suit and tie and are in government doesn't necessarily mean their theory is any better than anybody else's. And so my view would be, it's sort of like a fascinating but weird little part of ufological history, is what their story represents. In the same way, I told the story about the landmines of the dogs. That's sort of a weird little aspect of Pentagon research that in the bigger picture might not mean anything, and again, if we could understand how to really, use the powers of the mind to find landmines, it would be a big part. So I kind of view it as a strange aspect of government research by people who were partly belief-driven, but also scrambling around for answers in a subject that is so bizarre that we don't have the answers yet. So.
What is your take on Dulce, New Mexico?
Oh yeah. The Dulce story is a strange one. It's a town in New Mexico, which I've been to a couple of times, where there's this huge mesa where a lot of stories suggesting there's some sort of underground base or installation in the Dulce area. And UFO Hunters, the History Channel show, did an episode on it some time ago. There's actually been a lot of cattle mutilations in the area going back to the 70s. Again, through the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI has released a file about this thick all about cattle mutilations in the Dulce area. Talking about how they collected reports from veterinarians, police officers who'd seen these black and unmarked helicopters in the air and strange lights. So there's definitely been something going on there. And a friend of mine, Greg Bishop, wrote a book called Project Beta, all about the Dulce story. Well, about 3 or 4 chapters, I should say, are all about Dulce. And there's no doubt in my mind that something's been going on at Dulce. It's not just random sightings, that there has been some sort of installation there. Now, You know, whether it's a military installation, a secret thing, an alien thing, a bit of both, who knows? But I think there's definitely some installation either is there or has been there in the past.
Somewhere I saw drawings of a very extensive base underneath the
Yeah, yeah. Somebody who said they worked there did some drawings and said there was sort of different levels, like 6 or 7 levels to the base and whatever. But you know, because a lot of these stories are coming from different people who don't know each other, that's sort of a good pointer towards the fact that something was going on. I know that certainly the reports today are less than they were in the 70s and 80s. It doesn't necessarily mean it's closed down, but you know, we need to address more.
What do, I don't know if you know this or not, but what do the think tanks, what is their perspective on the Bible and maybe, demons or angels, or what is their?
Well, yeah, I mean, they interpreted it literally because this was sort of looking at things from a purely Christian perspective. And so, you know, they didn't, as I said earlier, they didn't kind of look at it from the perspective of any other religious belief systems, you know, where some belief systems hold to the idea of reincarnation. They excluded that because it didn't fit in the idea of soul factories, you know, because the soul, if you believe reincarnation, the soul wouldn't go to somewhere else, it would be reincarnated immediately in another body. So they didn't, in other words, they didn't even, I guess, consider other ideas. That they were purely looking at it, from a Christian perspective. So that they literally viewed, you know, some demons, fallen angels, the different tiers and levels that are spoken about. That they literally viewed it in that perspective.
I think we have time for just one or two more questions.
I'm just curious, I don't know if you would have gone this deep in it or not, but we know our belief system tells us about angels and about fallen, at least one, Lucifer. Is there any indication that among demons we only think negatively when we hear demons? Is there any hierarchy of demons, or maybe good demons? That sounds kind of a oxymoron, just to say it.
Yeah, they actually do talk a little bit about the whole idea of, you know, powers of good, but they don't, throughout the book, and all the people I spoke to, and certainly Ray, they never discuss any evidence of seeing that here right now. They viewed it that the evil entities, if you like, were trying to get their clutches into us now, and that when the final battle comes, then the good side will show itself.
Well, we know, I think or at least we think we know good when we see it, and we sure know evil when we see it. There must be something, a lot of gradations in between, so I think
yeah, I mean, I can only sort of go on what they said and what they concluded, but everything they looked at, they viewed in a negative fashion. But they didn't deny that there wasn't positive as well. They just hadn't seen it in relation to UFOs in their view. They thought the whole UFO thing was just negative.
in some religions we see in other countries where they cut off a kid's hand because he stole candy or something like that. And to them, it makes good sense. That's pretty evil to us. So there's a whole lot of shades of gray out there. Thank you. They generally don't have candy after stealing bread.
We have time for one more question.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, it's not a question so much as going back to Dulce, New Mexico. Chuck and I went up there. We took my Jeep up there. We drove the same road the UFO hunters were on. Then we found a nice dirt road going down the back instead of this gravel thing going up and whatnot. There are power lines going up there, but only enough to support the microwave towers that you see there and the forestry service viewing. We drove that whole mesa, okay, every road that we could find on this GPS and everything else. We saw absolutely nothing, okay? And to support a base takes a lot of support personnel, right? I mean, cooks and the whole 9 yards. It's just not evident there. The people in the town don't seem to know anything about it. I mean, there's one motel in that stinking town because there's a casino in it, and there's 2 restaurants, and one of them had only opened up a month before we got there.
No, it is a small area. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
The main thing that keeps a lot of people interested is that There were, have you ever heard of Project Gas Buggy? Have you ever dug into that? Project Gas Buggy was actually part of the nuclear test program, which was undertaken in that area back in the 1960s. If you look at Project Gas Buggy in Dulce, you'll see it was actually undertaken right where all the cattle mutilations were done in the 70s. Some people speculated that some of these incidents might have been connected, that somebody was monitoring the cattle herd for fallout and things like that. But if you Google Project Gas Space Buggy, you'll find a lot of information on that, an official project that went on there. So we know that there were military projects in that direct area back in the 60s. That's why I said today certainly there's certainly not the coverage given as there was. You know, as I said, the FBI have now declassified this file, which you can find. You can download as a PDF from the FBI's website. It's called Operation Animal Mutilation. That's what the FBI call it. And you go to their website and click on all the Freedom of Information section, you'll find it. And it's just packed with reports of sightings of black helicopters and UFOs and cattle mutes, all in round Dulce. So something was going on, as I said, but whether it is today, that's the big question.
Well, it was hard to see anything.
Can I say one thing before you close out? Because we may never get into this particular subject again, and I have a personal story I want to share with the group, because sometimes we need to hear these things to know they're real. My daughter last year, who is a 50-year-old nursing student, single mom, was getting ready to graduate from nursing school, lives down in the hill country in South Texas, where they have winding roads, lots of trees, no shoulders on the roads. She was driving with her 14-year-old daughter, thought did see a squirrel. She had just passed a highway patrolman. Nobody else was on the road, but she saw this squirrel, tried to miss it, hit the shoulder, gravel in an incline, and as she's going down and tries to right the car back up, she overcompensated and she ended up head-on with another automobile. And it was a really bad crash because it removed the whole front end of her car. And she was pinned under the dash with her legs and arms. She could not move either, and she looks over at her daughter, who was 14 at the time, and she's leaning out cold against the passenger door, and Kim is yelling, Bethany, Bethany, trying to get her attention, couldn't get any response, and she said, deep in her heart, she knew that her daughter was either dead or dying. And this man walked up to the car door, and she said he was so tall she couldn't see his face, but she could see his jean belt halfway up the window, and he reached in and grabbed her arm and said, be calm, help is on the way.